Well, hello everybody. This is Jim Peacock with Peak Careers Consulting, and today we're going to interview Dr. Nancy Schlossberg and talk about transitions. So, do you work with clients who seem to be blocked in their career development, or do you struggle with how to help people who are stuck in a career transition? Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Nancy Schlossberg, who developed the career transition theory and has written a number of books on this topic. So you can actually, if you click on this link here to peakcareers.com, it'll actually, that will take you to a blog I wrote recently also on this topic. And this is a picture of Nancy and I. Nancy was at the National Career Development and was signing her books, Too Young to Be Old. And I had a chance to catch up with Nancy. Just as a little note on the bottom, I have these my three words. I try to keep those in front of me. I have them on my computer. I actually have them on my refrigerator, and I have them on my bathroom mirror. These are three words to sort of guide me in 2018. And if you want to know more about that, you can find some information on my website. Today, we're going to talk with Dr. Nancy Schlossberg, who is an expert in the areas of adult transitions, retirement, career development, adults as learners, and intergenerational relationships. She's a past president of the National Career Development Association, co-president of a consulting group, Transition Works, a professor emerita from the Department of Counseling and Personnel Services from the University of Maryland. So welcome. This was the first when we actually had Nancy come to Maine Career Development in 2006, and this was this was your first book on retirement, transitions in retirement. And then that last summer, we Too Young to Be Old, that was at National Career Development. And as I was prepping here and talking with Nancy, I found out I missed one in between. And what was the name of that book? Revitalizing
Retirement, Reshaping Your Identity, Relationships, and Purpose.
Great. Well, thank you, and I really appreciate. Just had a great chat with Nancy, as I'm still suffering with snow in Maine, and she's down in Florida enjoying the warmer weather. So, anyways, I want to jump right in here, and my first question is just curious about what was your motivation when you developed this transition theory? I mean, where did this thing come from, and how did you come up with these 4 S's? Where did this all start?
Well, I can tell you exactly. My husband and I were living in Detroit, and it was a 10-year stint. He had a marvelous job, and I was at Wayne State University. But we did not want to die in Detroit. It's a wonderful city, but we moved back to Washington. In the process of moving to Detroit and then getting ready to move back to Washington, I started to struggle. I wanted to move back to Washington. I was in control. I had a very close friend who lived in Washington. I had a wonderful job. I got a job as the first woman executive of the American Council on Education. It was a dream job. So I was having problems, though. Why was I upset? Why was I feeling out of sorts? I didn't understand it because I wanted this transition. So I had a very good friend who was a researcher at Wayne State University, Sue Smock. And she said, let's sit down and make a laundry list of all of the things that might go in to geographical moving, to that transition that could be upsetting or facilitating. And we sat in her living room and we started making this laundry list, which are really later became variables. But I started to look, and then I did research. I thought I got to find more about geographical moving because it's an ordinary transition. Everybody moves. Well, you're still in Maine.
Well, actually, I grew up outside of Detroit.
Oh, okay. So we've all moved, and it seems simple, but it has consequences. So I decided to study it. I studied people who moved who were in the armed services because there's an expectation of moving, and compared them with just ordinary couples. Well, I have to tell you one funny story if we have time for a funny
Yeah.
story. So I'm interviewing this woman in the armed service, and she said, you know, I have followed my husband. We have lived in 15 places, but I am not following him again. I am not moving. So now this is back in 1973 or 72, 73. And my head is, sure, she's part of the women's movement. I understood. But I was smart enough to control my assumptions. So I said, well, tell me a little bit, why aren't you willing to move? And I'm waiting for her to say, I'm tired of following him and this and that. She said, I can't move. I'm having an affair. Well, that is not what I expected. And it was a very good lesson. Control your assumptions as an interviewer. So that was my first study. Then I was at the American Council a little bit, but after a short time, I moved to the University of Maryland as a professor. And I was there for 28 years. I worked with the people in the measurement department. I discussed the transition framework with them. I showed them what I had. And then I started doing a number of transition studies, maybe in total 20, 25, I don't know. But with each one, I would learn something new, and I would circle back to the measurement people, and eventually got the model, developed the model that exists today. Now, the 4 S's are your variables, but are people going to be interested in reading about variables? See, there's another goal I have in here. I want to translate what I know and what I'm learning from other people into readable works, into making this theory practical. And so that's my goal. And since retirement, that has definitely been my goal, continuing to write in this area. I wanted a framework that explained transitions, but also that could be used in a practical way. Does that give you some?
Yeah, I mean, and for those people who may not know the 4 S's, I mean, it's really looking at that situation, you know, how much of an impact is it, what kind of, in the self is the second one, and well, I should have you talk about the 4 S's. Maybe just give a quick overview of the 4 S's there.
Well, there's more to it, of course, than the 4 S's, but think for a minute. I want to go back. And when you are thinking about a transition, or you're in the middle of a transition, or you're sort of 2 years into a transition, what happens is that you have, let's say you're just moving, you're going to move. Before you move, or before you take the new job, before you become a great grandparent, your life has been pretty organized. You have some roles, you have relationships, you have your daily routines, and you have your assumptions. Then you move into a transition, and there's this never land of a few years, anywhere from 6 months to 6 years, depending on the transition, until you develop a new life and establish a new set of roles, relationships, routines, and assumptions. But what makes the difference in how you negotiate that, this murky middle period? And that's what the 4 S's are. Those are your potential resources for dealing with the transition. So you can have 50 people in a room, all experiencing their first supervisory job, or all experiencing a year after retirement. So they all are facing the same transition, but each person is handling it differently. And what explains that are your 4 S's. if your situation when you retire is terrible, and you have a mother who needs care and a daughter who's on drugs, your situation is not good. Where somebody else, the situation, their kids are intact, their parents are healthy. And so you have to look at the person's situation. You then have to look at yourself, what you bring to the transition. And there are pessimists and there are optimists. And you can be a healthy pessimist, but make yourself be optimistic. But what you bring to it, do you see the glass as half full or half empty? You are a resource, a potential resource. The third is, what are your supports? And that's really important. And it's not just what are your supports, what's sabotaging you also. Not just straight supports, but you want to look at institutional supports. And if you want to hear about a study that really dealt with institutional supports in a few minutes, I'll tell you. And what about personal supports? And the fourth are strategies, your coping strategies. The research shows us there are thousands and thousands of coping strategies, that they can be categorized. But the bottom line is a person who uses lots of coping strategies flexibly is going to be better than the person who always relies on the same strategy. Now, here's the point. You can say, okay, I'm dealing with this transition. Are my resources a plus or a minus? Are my supports a plus or a minus? Am I a plus or a minus? Are my coping strategies a plus or a minus? Now, actually, Stephanie Kay and I developed something called the Transition Guide, which follows the model, and it's a self-scoring. You can take it. You can see where your strengths are, what needs strengthening of your 4 S's, and then develop some strategies to do that. So the other thing, that these 4 S's are the variables that make a difference in how you negotiate the transition. But a transition also is a process over time. And the way you feel about a transition today is not the way you will feel a year from now or 2 years from now.
Right. And and that's it. So in this 5-week seminar that I do on this transitions topic, the first week we read some articles, actually one that you gave to me, and some other articles on the transitions, and we sort of do a deep dive and discussion into transition. Then the second week we really get into William Bridges' work, and Bridges is kind of that you got to begin with the end, and then you got that neutral zone that you just talked about, really. And then you start something new, you begin something new. His theory seems to be more process and kind of thinking, but yours I always feel like is just more practical. What's your thoughts on comparing those two and Bridges' work?
Well, I've been on a program with Bridges, and I like his work, and it is dealing with the process. But what I like about my work is that it adds the 4 S's, the variables, because it's not just about process. It's about your resources for coping with the beginnings and the endings. I think they meld together. I would have loved to have done some work with him, but that never happened. And so I think they complement each other. But I don't think, I think the transition model that I've developed is very practical, and that's what I like about it.
Yeah, and like for me as a career practitioner, and that's pretty much who my audience is, people who are doing this career work. By having this filter, kind of the 4S filter going on in the background, you can kind of say, all right, the situation isn't bad for this person. It's really, they seem to have that under control. And they sort of have, a positive view of it, but they have no support, right? I mean, I can go through the 4 S's and kind of go, what is this client's weakness? What's blocking this particular person? And then I can look at what's working, what's maybe not working, and then it guides my work as a career coach.
Yeah, well, and that's why that's the way I feel. Do you have time? Do we have time for me to tell you an interesting research?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I don't know if you ever got to know Zandy Leibowitz, but she was at the University of Maryland, very creative young woman, and died very young. And at the time that I knew Zandy, and I was at Maryland, we had a contract with NASA Space Flight Center, the Goddard plant, and we ran a career center there. Now, I didn't run it, but I was there. Well, and it was going very well. And we heard from NASA that they were going to be riffing, a riff is a reduction in force. They were going to be eliminating some jobs. They were going to do it by computer. They plugged things in, veterans preference, number of years, necessity for the mission of NASA. So the computer came up with 55 jobs that had to be eliminated. Well, those 55 jobs were 55 people. It's not just jobs, it's people. So Zandy and I decided we wanted to research this. We personally interviewed all 55 men the week they were riffed. Now, there's a little side story here. It turned out they were all men, and that was accidental. All of the people were men. They did not tell their wives that their jobs were over. They got dressed as if they were going to work because it was Thanksgiving time, and they could not ruin Christmas for their families. So we interviewed them. Everybody I interviewed was devastated. They said, this is worse than cancer. This is worse than anything that's ever happened to me. Except two men. One was the grass cutter who said, I don't care where I cut grass. I can cut grass at a national airport. The other was a top executive who said, I'm so glad to lose my job. My life is so boring. I'm bored with my job. I'm bored with my wife. So now I'm out of here. But everybody else in between, the grass cutter and the top executive, were devastated. Really, I could give you heart-rending stories. Well, we told everybody we would be following them up 6 months later. And I can tell you, Jim, that I thought they would be even more miserable in 6 months than they were when I interviewed them. And what am I hearing? Oh my God, if I handled this, and I can handle anything. This turned out to be a piece of cake. What was the intervening variable? Institutional support. NASA did two things. They had outplacement counseling that really didn't help that much. They came in the week the people learned about their riff, but it was very superficial. But what NASA did that was fantastic is they assigned everybody whose job was eliminated to somebody in the HR department. So you had a buddy guaranteed until you replaced your job. That meant that you had that kind of institutional support. So, for example, the artist who was an artist at NASA was devastated by this because he was getting divorced, his father was ill, now he lost his job, and he was in the theater group at NASA. So his life was over. But guess what? With the help of the HR person, he started getting involved in a community theater project. So each person had a buddy. And that story that was in all kinds of publications, But it's not easy to replicate that. Most organizations don't have the person power to do that. But that shows the value. You cannot assume the way you feel the day of the riff is how you'll feel 6 months later. That's number one. And that over time, your attitude will change, but it depends on your resources. In this case, it was institutional.
Right. And that's the third S, that support was so important to have that. But
Right.
you know, the thing that I think a lot of people, this is my perception, is they don't, you have the four S's and they help structure your thinking. But to me, it's the impact of the change in roles, relationships, and routines that just is astounding. I left the community college here to go full time into my business. My decision, I was ready to do it. I was just not ready to like, who, well, who am I? I'm not the director of advising and career anymore. But yeah, so I'm Peak Careers, the owner of that. But boy, the routines. I mean, it was so impactful. And I think could just talk just a little bit about that, and then we'll wrap this up.
Well, I could go on forever.
I know it's a huge piece.
The routines are so important. Even if you just move from one part of town to another part of town, where do you stop for coffee? Where do you still use the same cleaners? It seems so minor, but it's so important. And when you move from one city to another, or one job to another, or you move up in your first supervisory position, whatever it is, your routines shift, change, and you feel very discombobulated for a while. So I thought, I think the roles are fairly clear. I do think the routines, it was not something I had thought about before. It was through interviews with people and finding out the things that really troubled them. And that came out clear. Tell you a case, a woman I know had wanted to be a dean. She was a professor and she wanted to be a dean. And she finally had this opportunity to go to it for a terrific job, but it was in another city. She had a very supportive husband. What stopped her? She had a son with cystic fibrosis who was going to be having a heart-lung transplant. I think it was heart and lung. I don't remember what, but it was some major, major surgery, and she couldn't go. She couldn't disrupt her life at that point. There was enough going on. So sometimes just thinking about, she would have loved the change in role, but she could not deal with a whole new world, new routines, and so forth. So I think transitions are complicated. But if I may say something about, where is it? About my new book. In this book, which is Too Young to Be Old, there's a lot in there about age bias, but there are two chapters. In one of them, I dissect transition theory. I go into great detail. And another chapter in detail on coping strategies. But there's a lot that has to do with aging in it, caring for a spouse, caring, family issues, health issues. And then there's, of course, a chapter on retirement. But I just wanted to mention that whatever I do, I always build in the transition theory, because my mission is to help people understand it so that they can use it with their work with clients.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, and it makes sense, and it's practical. You can get focused, and you can kind of say, this is working and this isn't working. What are we going to spend our time on? And I think sometimes the clients just need to hear, oh my gosh, this is normal.
Yeah.
and that this too will pass, is sort of what you
Right.
said before.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm going to wrap this up, but try to keep my these interviews to about 20, no more than 20, 25 minutes. And I just want to say thank you and wrap up our chat here. So I'm Jim Peacock with Peak Careers Consulting. I offer the Facilitating Career Development class here in Maine since 2001, and now I'm also offering it in New Hampshire, Vermont every year. I have online discussion-based seminars, so they're with career practitioners and tend to have 5 to 8 people. If you're interested in this topic, you can check out my 5-week transition seminar. I also have other topics coming up. This week is a Holland-based one, and there's also one coming up that's on working with K-12 career development. And I do workshops and individual career coaching. If you are a career practitioner and would like to sign up for my newsletters, you can sign up on my website and get the top 10 tips for working with an undecided person. And if you want to connect with me, I'm in a variety of different social media forums. So I just want to say thank you very much, Nancy, for joining us. This was great. I have about 50 more questions, but I really want to try to keep these interviews to a time frame, and maybe we can do it again. But thank you so much.
Thank you.